Hello there, Mandy here. Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart is not just a podcast. It's also a book, a free online grief group, and a one-on-one private coaching practice. If you are interested in learning more, visit mandykapehart.com to find out how restorative grief can help you heal heart, mind, body, and spirit. Welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. You are listening to episode 217, titled Staying Connected Without Losing Yourself, Grief, Narcissism, and Repair with Sterlin Mosley. Have you ever walked into a family gathering or a familiar relationship and felt your whole nervous system tense before anyone even said a word? Well, this week on Restorative Grief, I'm joined by Sterlin Mosley for a grounded, compassionate conversation about narcissism as a relational disorder, not a label for villains in our lives, but as a pattern that shapes how we protect ourselves, connect with others, and sometimes lose our way. We're going to explore why grief so often collides with self-focused or confusing responses, how our bodies react when old dynamics resurface, and what it looks like to stay in relationship with people that we don't want to cut off while still honoring our limits. So if you've ever wondered how to navigate those family systems, long-standing wounds, or emotionally complex relationships during a season of loss, this conversation is here to offer clarity, compassion, and a few steady steps forward. Hey everyone, welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. I'm your host, Mandy, and today on Restorative Grief, I am joined by Sterlin Mosley. He's a professor, a writer, and a practitioner whose work centers on empathy, identity, and the ways we stay connected without losing ourselves, which I love. He teaches human relations at the University of Oklahoma and is the author of The Center of the Universe and The Narcissist in You and Everyone Else. I'm so grateful to talk with him today about how these patterns can intersect with grief, why so many grievers encounter confusing or self-focused reactions, and what's possible when we respond with clarity, compassion, and a grounded sense of self. Sterlin, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Restorative Grief.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start with kind of defining narcissism because it's a very commonly misused phrase, frankly. So when you talk about narcissism, what are you meaning? What are you referring to? And how has pop psychology and the internet distorted or oversimplified the concept?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always love to start there because you're absolutely right. It's first of all, it's being thrown around in very weird instances where it's like, okay, that's not what it is. So, the way I define narcissism is at first and foremost is a deficit of empathy. And to me, that's kind of the easiest entry point for people to understand it. Of course, there are the clinical aspects of it that can be that many people recognize or think they do, sort of a grandiose self-image, tendency to center oneself as the center of attention in most interactions, tendency to exploit relationships or others for one's own gain. But really, I think at the heart of all of those things is the lack of empathy, or the inability or lack of desire to use one's empathy towards others. They're often quite self-empathetic. They can have compassion for themselves. But that's the way I define it. And I think it's the sort of clearest entry point into understanding what empathy is sort of a condition that means that someone just has difficulty empathizing with others. And I like to distinguish that from, and I'm glad some of this is changing. A lot of literature around autism and things like that try to say that, well, that autistics, which I am myself, have difficulty empathizing, which is not true. There's just different pathways to that, and it's been overstated. So that's my sort of basic definition of what narcissism is. And I actually like to define narcissism as a relational disorder, rather than, yes, it affects the person's psyche and relationship to oneself, but it primarily shows up in relationship to other people. Because those are where the complications tend to arise, is when they interact with others and they can't decentralize themselves from that. from that space.
Yeah, I mean, you make it sound so much more approachable and clear. And I love it framed as a relational disorder because I feel like that's when people start throwing the label around when they can't get through to someone or they feel like it's very complicated to understand or communicate with a person. It also makes it sound like we are all narcissistic to some degree. And so I'm curious. I know you've identified 27 subtypes of narcissism. And so, how do those actually show up in our day-to-day relationships if we're all carrying something?
Right. Yeah, so I think, by virtue of having an ego, which most humans do,
Yep, yep,
I
much as
think,
we'd like to deny it.
right, exactly. I think that that narcissism, Freud, as much as Freud had lots of issues that,
Yep,
but I do think that his identification of the primary ego and then what he calls the secondary ego are really important. So we all have a primary ego where we've individuated, right, from uh, the mother, from the whole, as it were, and to some extent, particularly in the Western world, that individuation is necessary, right? It's what allows us to sort of set ourselves apart and advocate for our needs, and all of those things are healthy, and good. And sometimes you need to be able to centralize yourself in order to get things done and achieve your goals, or just take care of yourself. And then secondary narcissism develops as a sort of defense strategy around, there's lots of different reasons why someone develops secondary narcissism or what people would consider a narcissistic personality. And a lot of them, are around environment, and there's some genetic components, but it's basically an armor. So I like to imagine it like an armor that the ego puts on and can't. I mean, the ego's already an armor, but it's like becomes soldered to the person, right? Where the plates of the armor just cannot come off because there's the guarding against vulnerability. And so, the 27 subtypes that I came up with, I also, studied personality psychology and personality typologies. And I like to use the Enneagram model. And so there's 27 different subtypes within the Enneagram. Most people think of 9 types, but there's 27 types. And so the 27 subtypes sort of map against the full range of human ego expression, more or less. And so I thought, well, if you have these basic ego expressions, then you have to have a narcissistic version of each of those kind of personality subtypes. So that's where that came from. And basically, without needing to know what all 27 of them are, um, the premise is just that we all have the capacity for narcissism. Now, do we all develop NPD? No, right? And in fact, it's very rare that it's diagnosed, only because I think narcissists don't present a lot in therapy for one reason.
sure,
And
sure.
when they do, I think practitioners aren't often, um, maybe you take a class on personality disorders like I did when I was getting my master's, but you have to kind of pursue being able to recognize narcissism and how it shows up. And so I just think it's underdiagnosed, which is why I don't really talk about it as in the clinical sense, because I think that you don't need to have a degree to be able to recognize these traits because they're in all of us. It's just to what extent have they become sort of codified, is the word I would use.
Yeah. I love that you married the concept of those Enneagram subtypes to recognizing the unhealthy ego patterns we use to create safety for ourselves, right? Because that's exactly what we see in grief work as well, as we're all looking for safety, security, and belonging, and we're all going to do whatever it takes, even if it means going back to those baseline, very young responses that lead us towards what feels like safety now, whether or not it is anymore. At least it was once upon a time, and I think it really takes a lot of disruption to those patterns and awareness to be able to come up with something that serves us now a lot differently. And I'm curious, what is the difference between recognizing those tendencies and kind of a healthy narcissism, if that's a phrase, um, and then like the harmful patterns that I know we're all very fearful of being labeled with?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think self-care, um, is if we can use the term healthy narcissism, I think that there's a form of sort of healthy selfishness, right? Where, you've got to put the life, preserver on first before you save someone else. Like all of those kind of idioms are true because there are times, especially for people who have a tendency towards people pleasing or, caretaking to the point of not taking care of themselves, which I think um, at some point many people get into at some point in their lives. And it's important to remember that it's okay to have your goals and your interests and your needs and to advocate for those things, right? When it becomes narcissistic is when all we're advocating for are our needs and our interests and our desires, right? And we are no longer considering or are unable to consider what other people need or want or asking of us. Um, Now, of course, I have many people that will come to me and say, they'll read my work or read about narcissism and be like, I'm afraid I'm a narcissist. I'm like, narcissists aren't usually afraid that they're narcissistic,
Right. Yeah.
right? They just aren't. So I think that sort of gap in sort of perception and being able to appraise, like, am I, is a good sign, right? Because it means that we're self-appraising, we're looking at our behavior, we're asking ourselves, was I being selfish? And also being able to repair. When we're all going to make mistakes, we've all hurt someone's feelings in our lives, whether we, you know, think we haven't or not. And we've all done things that may be selfish and or had periods of time, in our lives where we had diminished capacity. Maybe we were grieving, or um, uh, many different things. We lost our job, or whatever. Our relationship is in trouble, and we can have diminished capacity that can sort of look like a period of selfishness, but that's why we have to look at narcissism across a lifespan, right? It's not something that just develops, one day, when you're in your 30s or 40s or whatever. It's been there and it's been present. Um, and part of, I think, maybe the grace for narcissists is that they lack that kind of self-appraisal to go back and look at their behavior and say, well, maybe that was selfish, or unless they're really actively doing work. So I think we just have to realize that, a brief period of selfishness or instances here and there where we've been a little prideful or grandiose, or those are normal human things, right? And it doesn't mean um, that we're narcissistic. And if you can self-appraise and are willing to go back and look at those things, there's a good chance that that's not what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the way that we get nervous about how we show up, and we can speak to this too quite a bit more on like the nervous system responses as well when we feel threatened or when we're grieving. Um, the nervousness around showing up properly or trying to disrupt our patterns or to your point, asking, am I a narcissist is never a good sign of, yes, you are a narcissist. It's like when we would, when we became parents, we were like, are we good parents? Yeah, probably because we're concerned, right? We have care. We're worried about our impact on others. And that is a part of empathy. That's an expression of it that brings us back around to that relationship part. Um, I'm thinking about grievers right now who are struggling in their relationships. When grief comes into your story, you end up being very cared for right away, and then it fades very quickly. And often the care that is present can feel dismissive or self-referential. I remember when I was going through my latest miscarriage a few years ago, everybody had a story about miscarriage and advice to give, and it was so oddly disconnected as much as I could compassionately understand they're trying to relate, right? And I just curious from your perspective, why grief moments like that trigger what feel like narcissistic tendencies in people to kind of reflect on their own stories and put their empathy aside almost as a demonstration of empathy instead of recognizing they've um, got the script flipped
Right.
over.
Yeah. That's a really great question. Yeah, I think that I really like this, idea that there's just certain mechanisms we have as human beings that are self-protective, right? And I think in grief in particular, um, and we, as I'm sure you've talked about many times, is like, we grieve many things in our lives, right? And some of them are big and some of them are minute. Um, and and I think, we can probably weather small griefs like, I lost my favorite pen, that may last a few minutes, right? Um, but there are those big things, right? Miscarriages, death, the loss of a relationship, that really, as a self-protective measure, we go inward and we protect ourselves, and it's a normal, we're talking about nervous system stuff. That's a normal nervous system response to harm, right? To loss and harm. And so, I think what happens is that, particularly if you are someone that tends to run higher empathy, I talk about these 7 levels of empathy, right? And if you're, average to upper average or high empathy, um, and I've experienced this myself, there have been times in my life where I'm like, I can't. Like I'm trying to process something, and we have that diminished capacity, and I think that that's normal, and I think it's okay, right? And now, of course, uh, ideally we would seek out, help to help us process through some of that grief so that we don't get stuck in a place like that. But I think that it's a self-protective measure to prevent us from completely imploding on ourselves. And so that drawing in of our energy, that diminished capacity to empathize with others, the where the stories that people are well-intended stories, right, or other people empathizing with you don't land, because we need to experience our individual experience before we can globalize it. And I think sometimes there's a tendency, usually because other people are uncomfortable with your grief, right? There's a tendency for people to want to globalize it before you've had a chance to experience it on an individual level. And I think that that's totally normal on their part. And it's normal, or uh, yeah, I mean, I usually don't use that word, but it's very normal to not want that, right? Whenever you're going through that. And it can look like we're not empathizing or we're not being compassionate, but really it's self-protective.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, that concept of globalizing something before you're ready to do it also happens on the opposite hand, where we attempt to globalize our experience and our understanding before we've done the work. I'm curious if what your opinion is of that, because in my line of work, I see it constantly, and I am always personally grieved and wanting to slow people down and let them marinate and sit with themselves and learn what is shifting within them.
Yeah, no, I love that. It just kind of I can relate personally. My mom died suddenly in 2021 on Thanksgiving.
Oh,
And it was a sudden death and all of that. And I remember when I was working with my therapist, I kept saying, well, everyone loses a parent at some point, right? And I just started to immediately,
yep.
of course, after the initial trauma of it, and she really insisted. She's like, you gotta, yes, they do, but how is this for you? I had a very specific history with my mom, and she struggled with alcoholism, and I was sort of her caretaker, and so she was like, what does it mean for you? Right. And I think it was wanting to skip over sort of some of that processing because, in my mind, I was like, well, other people have lost a parent or a child or whatever. And who am I to be in this individual kind of experience of my, it felt like wallowing at a certain point. I think it's a sort of form of bargaining with the grief process, right? Where you're trying not to fully go into it. And so I think that's really important. And that's not narcissism. That's being a human, right? And grieving your individual loss and experience. Um, and uh, I just there's no human on the planet that is immune from that kind of grief. I've read, into a lot of uh, I like to read about different spiritual figures, and I remember reading about one particular man named Meher Baba, who's was regarded as a saint in India, and you know sort of transcended the ego and had this sort of self-realization story. And when his best friend died, he grieved, right? And all of his followers and were like, "You're grieving," and he's like, "Yeah, I'm a human, I grieve," right? So there's no one, right, that's above that, and it's not narcissistic to want to personally process your story and experience.
Yeah. When I think that too is, first of all, I'm so sorry about your mama.
No, thank you.
I lost mine in 2016. And so that's part of anytime someone says, I've lost my mom, I'm like, let's talk about that for the next 32 hours because
You're
I'm
right.
with you. And
Yes.
there are very few people who want to talk and
Yes.
want to process.
Yeah.
Um, and I think what's so interesting about what you talked about there too is I was thinking about how often when people are attempting to avoid going deeper in their grief work, they'll almost acquiesce to their therapist or the person they're talking with by saying like, yeah, I totally agree, you're right, and it's just lip service to try and avoid. And in that itself is a form of nervous system responses trying to keep us safe. We're fawning and we're not giving ourselves the genuine care that we need. And I'm curious about where you see narcissism or narcissistic tendencies making it a lot harder for people who are grieving in those tendencies in other people around them, making
Yeah.
it harder for them to grieve when they are trying to go genuinely in. So let's say I've got this recognition of I need to grieve this and I want to share with this person that loves me and is trying to say I'm to care for me, but all they keep saying is, "You're fine. Can you please come back over here and hold this down?" Or are you
Right.
done crying? I'd like to go out. Um, those kind of like relational dysfunctions can be really overwhelming. How would you encourage someone in those situations around boundaries and caring for themselves?
Yeah. It's that's a challenge. When you're grieving around someone who has narcissistic tendencies or is a narcissist full on, that but you're in one of the most vulnerable states, that you can be in. And narcissists also experience death and grieve, of course. But because of their empathy deficits, they may be able to deal with it for, in the acute phase, right? When it's just happened, and depending on how well they are at sort of kind of masking their narcissism, or if it's someone they knew and they lost them too. But because of their intolerance of vulnerability, um, in themselves, that's also projected outwards. And of course, they have intolerance of vulnerability in others. And so when you're in a grief state, by definition, you're vulnerable, right? And so I think, and I've dealt with people and coached people before that have been grieving and had a narcissistic partner, or someone in their lives that just was like, okay, but people die, get over it, or um, yeah, you've cried a lot, whatever the message is. And they oftentimes, especially if it's a partner or a parent or something like that, you keep going back to that person, um, because they are a central figure in your life, hoping that they will do a different thing, right? They're sort of asking them implicitly for permission to have the feelings that you're having. And they don't have the capacity to give you that, because they cannot tolerate it in themselves. So I usually tell people, you've got to find somebody who can hold the emotions that you're having. And sometimes that may only be a therapist that is compassionate and knows how to deal with grief. I've directed many people to, specific grief uh, counseling because they're looking for people in their lives, um, a person or multiple people in their lives who may have diminished empathy, and they can't give them that. And so what happens is that you get in this kind of relational kind of loop with the person where you're either hiding your grief in order to keep the relationship dynamic intact. Or some people will continue to try to demonstrate and show their grief and vulnerability only to be met with sometimes aggression or at the worst and dismissal, I guess, at best. I don't know which ones, they're both awful, right? So um, and so you've got to know where to go to get your needs met, and that's why it's so important to me that people are able to recognize narcissism in others, because once you know what you're dealing with, um, you no longer have the expectation that they're going to give you something different, and because uh, and it's not that narcissists can't change, but they have to want to do that, and it's hard work, and it sometimes doesn't work at all, and all they can learn is strategies or things to say without the feeling behind it. So it's sort of that accepting phase of this is what this person is capable of. Now you can state your boundaries, um, and I think that's incredibly important to state one's boundaries. You just can't always expect other people to to adhere to those things, and so you may have to state them over and over again, or you may have to decide, you know, that this relationship or the way that the shape of this relationship has to change in order to protect yourself, which is often the case with narcissists.
I'm thinking a lot as you're talking about the holiday season because that's we're plumb in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And we all know that there are family members we struggle with in every single family unit, whether we have had a healthy dynamic in the past or if current events have caused rifts and disagreements and conflict. And something you had said that I wrote down because it was just so accurate. They do not have capacity to give you that, the empathy, because they cannot tolerate it within themselves. That is something that I'm seeing a lot in people who are going back and being with family right now. And there's a push and pull of it, right? We don't want to disrupt the dynamic, despite the fact that the dynamic is very painful for us. Maybe it's a power dynamic to some degree, even as adult children. We have this desire to honor our parents or be connected or not maybe miss out for our kids, even. There are so many different layers and levels of trying to maintain relationship or create repair where a relationship has ruptured. um, how can we do that without self-abandonment and without sliding into appeasement or even emotional caretaking when the other person becomes upset with our boundaries or disrupted by our willingness to behave differently in the relationship on behalf of ourselves?
Yeah. Yeah, the holiday season is a great time to test one's
How healed
self-care.
am I? Do
You're
they get the
right,
heal?
exactly, exactly. It's I can't remember where the quote comes from, but there's a quote that's like, if you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your
With your
parents, right?
family. Yeah.
Right, with your family. And it's just really true because it's going to tax us the most. And I think that there's, I had to find that balance myself. I have, my grandmother, grandparents, but a grandmother in particular who um, was pretty narcissistic growing up, and which I think then in turn affected my mother's substance abuse throughout her life and all of that. So I've seen the generational kind of effects that kind of narcissism can have, and of course when my mother died, I found myself really angry at my grandparents for the ways that they parented or didn't, and I spend a lot of time with my grandparents who are now in their 90s, and it's interesting because I had to learn, um, I had my period where I really wanted to test them and, sort of test their empathy and would kind of challenge them, and then I just realized after, trying different strategies and stating my boundaries, and I cook dinner for them 3 or 4 nights a week usually. And then would be like, well, I'm not doing it because it's taxing me. And I just tried all of these different strategies, right? And um and for me, I did have to do a fair amount of gray rocking, which is, a strategy where you just don't give them emotional content. And it felt cold. Uh, and then I would try the opposite and tell them things and then react when they didn't respond the way I wanted them to respond. And so I've been through that kind of um, pattern. And I just got to a point where I realized to some extent I was kind of arguing with the reality of the situation, which was that they are who they are, right? Um, and knowing it became sort of intuitive, knowing like is safe to share and this isn't, right? This is the kind of content that I can trust this person with. And most of the time it's pretty superficial, or it was about topical things that they could deal with. And I would save the vulnerable pieces of myself for people that I trusted and felt safe with and that could hold it. Um, and knowing that sometimes those people maybe can't hold things and handle things because humans, right? But so there was this sort of, for me, this place of having to just accept that, okay, this is their capacity, and they can't handle or are unwilling to handle, these aspects of my emotion or experience, and um, but also not sort of overly molding myself to make them comfortable, right? Because then there's that aspect, and it's really a delicate dance, and it's one that may change daily or by the hour, right? Um, and there have been many times where I'm like, I'm just gonna have to leave this situation right now. Like I can't, and not in a conflict way, but it's just like I'm just gonna bow out. I'm gonna go home or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and and it takes time to figure out what that rhythm is, and and then it may change, and then you'll have to figure out a new rhythm. And so I wish there was like a prescriptive kind of thing I could say, but I think it's sort of knowing that trying those different strategies of getting somebody to respond a certain way, or caretaking because you think that's going to fix it or whatever. I think that's all normal. It's just eventually you get to a point, with some people, and with some relationships, it's harder, where um, you just have to accept where that person is at the moment and where you are at the moment, and that sometimes you're not going to meet, and you're going to have to get that need met elsewhere. And it's so hard with family because we're sort of hardwired to seek safety and security from
Right.
our family. And so the nervous system keeps trying to get that over and over and over again, even though, the response is often not what we want.
It makes me think a lot about how when we are communicating over text messages and tone gets lost, so fights
Yeah.
begin. It's very similar to what I'm thinking about when it comes to those family members we see once a year. And unfortunately, we continue to interact with them on social media. So we have this almost villainous opinion of them. Um, we've vilified their perspectives, their approaches. Maybe they've judged our approach or our we are their villains. And so now there's this enmity that just makes that so overwhelming. And then in person, that emotional management of the other person, instead of recognizing what do I have the ability to manage for myself, knowing that this hurts, knowing that it's layered grief, it's full of secondary losses. There's the relational loss, there's the safety loss, there's the vulnerability, there's the actual event itself that I want to talk about or I want to process. I find myself often setting a small boundary with myself, knowing the boundaries I would set with someone else are very hard to continually reinforce because that's my job. If I set a boundary,
Right.
I will get to the point where I take a deep breath and I just think, oh, okay, that's where they are.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's all I can offer myself in this moment because otherwise someone has to find bail money. And that's a bad choice for a holiday gathering, you know?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I love that, setting that boundary with yourself, because that's really um, that relationship is primary and the only one that's sort of guaranteed
Yeah.
through your whole life, right?
Yeah.
Um, and and so sometimes, and I think because it's so easy to get in these relational patterns of that basically to a greater or lesser extent sort of reproduce the kind of abuse cycle, maybe not at this grand scale, but at this like, little micro abuses or emotional, uh, you know, violence or damage or whatever the case may be with certain people in our lives. And the nervous system does get addicted to those cycles, right? And and sometimes just setting a boundary with myself where, where you say, I'm not I'm not going to hijack my nervous system today with trying to get this person to do XYZ.
I love that phrase.
And it takes that and it's just in that moment, um, I think you break the cycle and you may have to do it again and again. But I that's the kind of messaging I tell myself because that's really what you're doing is, you're hijacking your nervous system and resetting it back to something that may feel comfortable, but that is ultimately not healthy in the long run. So,
Yeah, I think when we start recognizing these patterns in ourselves to caretake or to minimize our feelings and our needs, and we become so resentful,
yeah.
um, that it becomes almost difficult to see that we're partnering with it, with our own oppression and our own repression and frustrations. And it's going to be really interesting to think about and even just hear from people who are able to name, "Oh, I have villainized that person. I have labeled them. I have minimized their humanity, their dignity, their self efficacy, their ability to grow and change by labeling them narcissist or putting them on a shelf." What do you see in people that can shift in their healing work when they start to see what they've done, how they've been complicit in their own pain?
Yeah. That's a really great point, and I love that. You know, I think, and that's what we see a lot of the internet content around. They're a narcissist, and it has this sort of witch hunty kind of,
Yeah. Yep.
it's sort of irony to me because it's like, you're villainizing this person who doesn't have empathy, and then you're sort of behaving the same
Doing
way,
it with
right?
a lack of empathy. Yep.
Exactly. And they're still humans. Yes, they can be challenging and difficult, but they're still human beings. They still grieve. They still, we all experience the same, fate in the end, right? So I think being able to, if you're gonna call yourself an empathetic person, then, walk the walk even with people that are villains in your story, right? Because then you realize they're not really villains. They're doing what they feel like they need to do or their nervous system has told them to do to take care of themselves.
Yeah.
And it also takes this sort of um the the villain label out of it because villain has this sort of um superhuman kind of connotation, right? Where there's there's no ability for them to grow or change, and you strip them of their humanity and their emotional content and their story, and then it kind of justifies you treating them however you want to treat them because you feel like you can, right? Because well, they don't have those feelings. Um, and and I've seen that with people where they've villainized, someone in their family they've identified as narcissistic, um, and even in my own story, like with my grandmother in particular, well, she has dementia now, and there are some days where she doesn't even know where she is, right? And then the fragility of that, all of that story about she did this and she did that and she was cold and all of that, like I can't hold that when I see this woman in front of me who is, sometimes scared because she doesn't recognize her living room.
Yeah.
And for me that was the moment where, when that those, more of those moments started to happen. it was sort of, that was when I was really able to let go of this story I had about this person. Um, it doesn't excuse, things in her life or that she's done that maybe were harmful, but um, but it doesn't serve me or her at this point to hold on to those narratives, um, when she can't even remember what she ate for breakfast, um, or that she had breakfast, or that she has had children. I mean, for that matter. So it's those kinds of moments, I think, where if people can access that part of the human experience and realize that narcissism is, yes, it's a relational strategy. There's deficits of empathy. There's all these things that they can do to people. Um, but if you can see past that and realize they're just trying to protect themselves and take care of themselves. And yes, um, it can have negative and sometimes devastating effects on other people. That's all true, but it's also true that they're humans.
Yeah.
And so I, and I've worked with people that are narcissistic, and I have seen a few of them who've identified it and have decided, like, I'm going to figure out where this comes from, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't still pop up, right? But I have seen some of them grow and change. Um, but there has to be a willingness, just like everybody else, to do that work. And they're just a little less likely to want to do that work because they don't recognize that there's a problem often. But
Yeah.
it can happen. And so if it can happen in one, you know, then the potential is out there, um, and it just shows the humanity of the whole experience. So I really think that's important. I'm glad you brought that up about how to sort of yes, recognize and name the strategies. I think that's important, but it's also important to remember that they're just people.
Yeah. I think that's the foundation of this grief work that I do is helping people recognize and honor their own humanity and dignity. At the end of the day, if nothing else changes, you're still valuable and you're still important. And so are the people who've harmed you. And I love that you have that anecdote of recognizing there's no value or benefit to either of us to try and hold someone accountable for a behavior that they can't even recall doing. And it doesn't excuse it, it doesn't let them off the hook, but it also doesn't mean you have to be the one to bear it as a memory, as a core training tool for your nervous system. Because that's what I think we're doing is if we can put a lens of let me collect different tools for my nervous system to heal. Well, shoot, holding on to the vitriol and the bitterness and the rage isn't a very good training tool because we've seen the outcome of that long term in a lot of examples on very public stages. So
Yes.
oh, Sterlin, this was a wonderful conversation. We could talk for a very long time. I know. You have a wonderful Substack. Please tell us about that for a quick minute.
Yeah, I think it's Sterlin Mosley at substack.com. I can never remember, but I'm sure we'll put it in the show notes. But yeah, I do a lot of writing about, I have guides I've created for recognizing narcissism. I have different essays I've written about different styles of narcissism, and also just articles about empathy and healing. And I post pretty regularly, so there's a good little chunk of information over there. And then I also, with my Enneagram work, my Enneagram business is called Empathy Architects, and you can find us on Instagram for that. So if you're interested in personality, the intersection between the personality typology and narcissism and all those things. And we have a Substack for that too. So I love to write, and I love to give people information that will sort of arm them, as it were, to heal and to be more compassionate to themselves and other people, because I really think that's the primary problem
Yeah.
in the world,
Yeah.
honestly.
I
So
agree. Well, thank you so much for all the work that you do and create and your deep well of empathy to put yourself out there and on the line for others to learn how to do it too. It means a lot.
yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to episode 217 of Restorative Grief. I think this conversation with Sterlin was so warm and inviting. And I loved the way he talked about how we have to remember over and over again that other people are still humans, even as they struggle to feel warm or human to us. When they don't have the capacity to meet us where we're at, we need to honor that and recognize that might be something they struggle with in themselves as well. So as we continue to learn how to grieve and how to grieve well, I hope we can also remember that others are doing the same, whether they are aware of it or not. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, thank you so much for being here. I am infinitely grateful I get to do this work. I love meeting new people like Sterlin and connecting with those of you who are feeling grief heavy and need a new place to reflect and gain some new tools for your own grief work and nervous system support. So if you enjoyed what you heard today, please subscribe to the podcast. Please leave a 5-star review and consider becoming a patron of the show as well. As patrons, for as little as $2 a month, you'll gain access to monthly bonus episodes as well as workbooks to go along with every single episode, this one included. Thank you as always to my future and current patrons. We cannot do this work without you. And as always, before we go, one last thing. Please remember, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.